Hello, I am Warcrimezuwu, a Magic the Gathering YouTuber, and I would like to thank you all for joining me in this, my Phyrexia All Will Be One limited guide. Today I want to show you how to get a leg up on your competition at your pre-release, as well as your drafts in the future. This is not meant to be an exhaustive review of every single card in the set, but simply a guide to what to look out for in terms of the archetypes, the best commons and uncommons in each color, and some tips and tricks to give you a head start in your drafts and sealed pools of this set if you don't have time to digest a larger limited guide. We're going to start with the new and returning mechanics of the set, just so you know how they all work. Then, we're going to talk about the best commons and uncommons in each color, so you know what to focus on in your draft. Then, we're going to talk about the limited archetypes, so you can get a feel for what kinds of decks are going to work. Then, we're going to talk tips and tricks, and then finally, we're going to go over the most powerful bombs in the limited format, just to make sure you know which rares to look out for, both when you're drafting and what you might be playing against. As a reminder, I'd like to thank you all for being here. Please, if you don't mind, go ahead and give me a subscribe and a like. It helps the channel a great deal in getting that organic reach. But without further ado, let's jump into the set. We're going to discuss a new mechanic first, oil counters. Now you can see these three wonderful cards, Axiom Engraver, Watchful Blister Zoa, and Rustvine Cultivator. And what they all do is somehow interact with oil counters. Now, oil counters do not have any inherent mechanical meaning. They don't do anything on their own, similar to the charge counters in previous Mirrodin blocks. But essentially, different cards will do different things with oil counters. This first card comes in with 2 oil counters, and you can tap and remove the oil counters to loot. Essentially, what this means is you have access to this ability 2 times. Watchful Blister Zoa comes in with an oil counter on it. When it dies, you draw cards equal to the number of oil counters on it. And what that means is you're incentivized to find a way to put more oil counters on it so you can draw more cards when it dies. Rustvine Cultivator can tap to put oil counters on itself or to tap and remove an oil counter to untap target land. So it can kind of provide mana on even number turns or odd number turns. But you'll find that a lot of different cards care about oil counters in different ways in this set. It's just something to keep an eye on. Next, we're going to talk about Toxic. Now, this is kind of a revamp of the classic Infect mechanic you might remember from the last Mirrodin block. Essentially, what Toxic reads is Toxic will always have a number next to it, and players dealt combat damage by this creature also get that many poison counters. For example, this lovely Tyrannax Atrocity here has Toxic 3, so when you hit your opponent with it, they'll get 3 poison counters. Crawling Chorus has Toxic 1, as does Pestilent Siphoner, so they will each give 1 poison counter to your opponent, that is. So it's different from Poison in that, or from Infect, in that the creatures still deal damage equal to their power to your opponent's life total, but they also give poison counters, and it's not triggered. It's like lifelink. They get the poison counters as the damage is dealt. This is going to be a core mechanic of several of the colors in this set. All but red have toxic creatures. I think blue... no mono blue card has a toxic creature either, I believe. But all of the colors except red can put poison counters on things in some way and proliferate those poison counters. We'll get to that in a moment. But toxic is something to watch out for. Of course, if you get 10 poison counters, you lose the game, regardless of your life total. So it's just another way to get killed or to kill that you're going to have to watch out for. Next, we've got Corrupted. Now, this is a special mechanic. It essentially grants your cards an extra powerful ability as long as an opponent has 3 or more poison counters. So one of the other design issues with Infect that they found was that it sort of created 2 different ways to win the game that were completely opposed to each other. If you ended up killing your opponent with poison, then their life total didn't matter. And if you ended up killing your opponent with bringing their life to 0, then the poison didn't matter. So in addition to making the creatures kind of do both, they've also introduced this mechanic where your cards get powered up if your opponent has just 3 poison counters. So if your deck doesn't have enough cards that can do poison to get them to 10 to kill them that way, you can just get them to 3, and then these cards become a lot more strong. Fleshless Gladiator can come back from the graveyard. Zealot's Conviction becomes a first strike combat trick stuck on an aura, so a very powerful card if your opponent has 3 poison counters. And Viral Spawning gains Flashback if your opponent has 3 poison counters. Flashback is only on this card in the set. They've kind of decided they can use it a little bit more liberally in future sets, so that's good to see as someone who loves the flashback mechanic. Similar things will be happening to mechanics like cycling, which will hopefully help to smooth out limited formats when it's put on sort of weak commons and uncommons. But anyway, that's the corrupted mechanic, so watch out for that. And then we've got 4 Mirrodin. So this mechanic is kind of a play on Living Weapon, but it creates a 2/2 red rebel instead of a 0/0. So a creature that can survive without the equipment. And you're going to analyze these not really as equipments, but when you're deciding if this card is good for your deck, you're going to look at it more as a creature. And the equipment is just a cool thing that the creature leaves behind when it dies. So we've got this Gold Warden's Helm, Barbed Batterfist, and Sylvok Battle Chair. The vast majority of these 4 Mirrodin cards are going to be in red and white. And it, in fact, sort of makes up a limited archetype in the set. So, 4 Mirrodin, one of the mechanics to keep in mind, it makes a 2/2, and the equipment immediately gets attached to it. So basically, this is like a 3-mana 2/3, 2-mana 3/1, and a 6-mana 6/6 Colossal Dreadmaw. But they leave behind the equipment when the creature goes away, or I guess if you choose to move the equipment to another creature. And now we're going to talk about the returning mechanics. So one of these returning mechanics, introduced in, I believe, New Phyrexia, and then brought back for War of the Spark, is Proliferate. Now what Proliferate does is very powerful. Choose any number of permanents and or players, then give each another counter of each kind already there. So, when you proliferate, you can do it on any number of permanents or players. You can put an oil counter on one of your creatures, another poison counter on your opponent, and a loyalty counter on one of your planeswalkers. There are 10 planeswalkers in this set, which is a lot, so you are going to be interacting with them a little more than normal, although they're all rare and mythic. But these proliferate cards are going to be powerful in all kinds of different decks, and the reason why they didn't put any +1/+1 or -1/-1 counters in this set is because they wanted to be able to print proliferate cards that were incredibly efficient. They brought back Thrumming Bird, they added this Volt Charge, there's other very good proliferate cards in this limited format that are going to be very good with your oil counters, they're going to be very good with your poison counters. It was just a killer mechanic to bring back. Next, we've got the best cards in each color. So we're just going to talk about a couple of commons and uncommons that I want you to look out for in your draft and sealed pools. First, we've got white. Planar Disruption. 1 and a white for an aura. Enchant creature, artifact, or planeswalker. Enchanted permanent can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. Now, this is just pretty efficient removal. It's sort of like, I mean, it is a pacifism, but that hits an artifact or a creature or a planeswalker. Nice that it hits a planeswalker, given that there are several rare planeswalkers. Somebody on Reddit crunched the numbers, and if in your average draft, about 2 people will have a planeswalker in their deck out of 8, so you're likely to see one each draft. Even if you don't end up drafting one, you're likely to play against one once in a draft. So having this common removal that deals with them is very handy because they can be very backbreaking. But it is just a pacifism. It can also hit artifacts and creatures. Very efficient, shuts down activated abilities as well, although worth noting, not triggered abilities or passive abilities. Next, we've got Bladed Ambassador. This guy's 1 and a white for a 3/1 Phyrexian Soldier at uncommon. Bladed Ambassador enters the battlefield with an oil counter on it. You can pay 1 and remove an oil counter from Bladed Ambassador. Bladed Ambassador gains indestructible until end of turn. So this card's very powerful with Proliferate, but even if you don't have access to Proliferate, this card feels awful to block because you can just pay a mana and keep it around once by removing that oil counter, even if you don't have access to Proliferate. Same with leaving it up. You know, it can block a 3/3 if you have 1 mana up and stick around. And then a 2 mana 3/1 is just good to have in any limited format. So Bladed Ambassador is very, very good. And next we've got another uncommon, but another removal spell, Ossification, 1 and a white for an aura. Enchant basic land you control. When Ossification enters the battlefield, exile target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls until Ossification leaves the battlefield. Now, this is an interesting card. It reminds me of On Thin Ice from Modern Horizons 1. It has to enchant a basic land, but that's not really a concern. In Limited, you should control a basic land pretty much literally all the time. And it's just an Oblivion Ring for a creature or planeswalker for 2 mana. In this format, I don't believe there's much that makes this worse than Oblivion Ring. You know, there's no like Ghost Quarter sort of shenanigans in this format, and so that the fact that this goes on a basic land is practically irrelevant. That text is there to make this not just a 2-mana Oblivion Ring in constructed formats where you might not be playing a lot of basic lands, or your opponent might have ways to flicker them or whatever. But it's premium removal in this limited format. Next, we're going to talk about blue. Now, these are all commons. First, we've got Chrome Prowler, 2 and a blue for a 3/2 Phyrexian cat artifact creature with flash. And when it enters the battlefield, tap target creature and opponent controls. So this is a blue card that just really helps your creature combat. Your opponent goes to attack, you flash this in, tap down their best creature, and then it can swing on your next turn. It's a very, very good play pattern. Just being a 3-mana 3/2 is pretty good with that tap text. And then we've got Malcator's Watcher. 1 and a blue for a 1/1 Phyrexian drone with flying and vigilance. This is also an artifact creature. And when Malcator's Watcher dies, oh my gosh, I'm getting tongue-tied today. When Malcator's Watcher dies, draw a card. Now, one of the coolest things about this card is you can swing with it a couple times, and then you trade it for like a Phyrexian Might or a 3/1 or something, and it replaces itself. And that feels pretty great. And then we've got Bring the Ending. This is 1 and a blue for an instant. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 2, or counter that spell instead if its controller has 3 or more poison counters. So this is going to obviously be better in those decks where you can get that corrupted text. But even if you can't play this on turn 2, Mana Leak, this is kind of like Mana Leak, the tax is 1 less, but that's always been a fine card. So Bring the Ending, definitely something worth considering. Next, we've got the best cards in black. First, we've got a common, Anoint with Affliction, 1 and a black for an instant. Exile target creature if it has mana value 3 or less. Or exile that creature instead if its controller has 3 or more poison counters. So this can exile something that costs 3 or cheaper at instant speed for 2 mana. Or, if your opponent has those 3 poison counters, that corrupted status, then this can exile anything for 2 mana. And even if you can't hit that corrupted, it's still pretty good to be able to remove something that costs 3 or less for 2 mana. And if you can hit that corrupted, this is an insane piece of removal. Definitely worth considering. Then we've got Shieldred's Edict. This one personally is going in my cube. This is 1 and a black for an instant. It's an uncommon. Choose 1. Each opponent sacrifices a non-token creature. Each opponent sacrifices a creature token. Or each opponent sacrifices a planeswalker. So this is just a very flexible piece of removal compared to other edicts where if your opponent just gets 2 creatures out, it feels awful. This one, if your opponent has a non-token creature and a token creature, you get to decide which one they're going to sack. And not to mention the fact that if they play a planeswalker, there's a 2-mana instant speed way to remove it. So very versatile card. And then we've got Testament Bearer. This is 3 and a black for a 4/1 Phyrexian Warrior. When Testament Bearer dies, look at the top 3 cards of your library. Put 1 of them into your hand, and the rest into your graveyard. She's a 4/1, which makes her very good for trading up if you leave her up as a blocker. Unfortunately, she can't chump mites. Or not chump, but she can't eat mites as a blocker, which is, going to be kind of a sticking point. But she can attack into a lot of boards and do a lot of damage, and you kind of get this anticipate, but the cards go in your graveyard when she dies. So very, very good to get that value on a creature that's only under curve on one of its stats. Can still trade evenly with other 4-drops. Next, we've got the best red cards. Volt Charge, 2 and a red for an instant. Volt Charge deals 3 damage to any target. Proliferate. So a 3-mana lightning bolt feels fine and limited. The fact that this can target your opponent's face is not irrelevant. And that Proliferate text in the red decks that sort of care about oil counters is going to be really cool. Next, we've got another piece of removal, Rebel Salvo, 2 and a red for an instant, with Affinity for Equipment. Deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker. That permanent loses indestructible until end of turn. So, very interesting. Now, if you control 1 equipment, which is not unreasonable in this for Mirrodin deck, this is a 2 mana for 5 damage at instant speed. The loses indestructible text is only relevant against like a cycle of mythics. So, unlikely to happen. But that Affinity for Equipment makes this, kind of reliably 2 mana, but you feel great about paying 3 mana for this still. So it's a very good instant speed piece of removal. Then we've got Barbed Batterfist. This is 1 and a red for an equipment for Mirrodin. Equipped creature gets +1/-1, and you equip for 1. So this is a 2-mana 3/1, which is not bad for trading. And then if you just have a creature that you want to increase the power with to beat on your opponent, this moves around for 1 mana. So, a creature that's great to trade, and then you can move the equipment off of the creature so it can block mites as a 2/2 as well. Just a lot of good in this common equipment. Next, we've got the best green cards. Now, I've already shown 2 of these in the mechanical explanations, but first, we've got Viral Spawning, an uncommon 2 and a green sorcery. Create a 3/3 green Phyrexian beast creature token with Toxic 1. Corrupted. As long as an opponent has 3 or more poison counters and Viral Spawning is in your graveyard, it has Flashback for 2 and a green. Now, this is pretty powerful. These 3/3s with Toxic 1, you'll notice if you're hitting your opponent with these, you're going to kill them with damage faster than you're going to kill them with poison counters. So this card really leans into that sort of corrupted aspect. A deck that's trying to get 3 poison counters on your opponent so that you get a lot of value. And a sorcery that makes a 3/3 for 3 and then flashes back to make another 3/3 is excellent value. You're essentially getting 2 decently costed cards for 1 there. Next, we've got the Sylvok Battle Chair, classic 6-mana 6/6 Trampler, but this time in the form of an equipment with 4 Mirrodin. It's 4 and double green for an equipment, 4 Mirrodin. Equipped creature gets +4/+4 and has Trample, and then it equips for 5 and double green, so 7 mana. Now, if you're seeing its teeth, it's too late. This is a Colossal Dreadmaw, and the 7 mana to re-equip is a little bit weird. Late in the game, if you have nothing better to do with your mana, you're going to do that. That's 1 more mana than this actually costs. But green decks in Limited have traditionally been very fine with playing a 6-mana 6/6 Trampler. And then we've got Tyvar's Stand. X and a green for an instant, also uncommon. Target creature you control gets +X/+X and gains hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Now, the really interesting thing here is you can cast this with X equals 0, meaning that leaving up 1 green with this in your hand lets you protect whatever your best creature is from removal, which is already pretty useful. But then you can also use this to kill your opponent out of nowhere. This is a combat trick, being an instant. You can win a combat, or if it goes unblocked and you have like 5 mana, +4/+4, that can end some games. So this card's definitely worth looking out for and worth playing. Next, we're going to talk about the limited archetypes in this set. So these are the sort of decks that the draft format is asking you to play with their Signpost Uncommons, which we're going to talk about all of here, and with the other sort of synergistic cards. So first we've got white and blue artifacts. Now we've got this Signpost Uncommon Cephalopod Sentry is 2 a white and a blue for an artifact creature, Phyrexian Squid. It's an X5, and its power is equal to the number of artifacts you control. So right off the bat, we're seeing that there's a lot of synergy in blue and white. A lot of their common creatures that happen to be okay happen to be artifacts as well, which means that these cards that have sort of this artifact fall ability, you'll see on the screen there's a lifelinker that gets bigger when an artifact comes in, and there's a blue artifact that is a 3-mana artifact that turns into a 4/4 every time an artifact comes in under your control, and when it comes in, you scry 2. So just these sort of like almost artifact fall cards that care about artifacts entering the battlefield. And then you've got these Phyrexian Might tokens, especially in white, but in most colors. And then you've also got, in white, the 4 Mirrodin equipments that happen to be mono white, really fit the bill for this. So Cephalopod Sentry, I don't think is a terribly strong Signpost Uncommon. Maybe if you have a way to make a lot of mites, you can kind of get this up to being a 4-mana 3/5 flyer is fine. It's pretty good, and a 4-mana 4/5 flyer is excellent. And it counts itself, so maybe I'm underestimating it a little bit. But the blue-white deck is definitely trying to do artifacts. It might care about poison a little bit. It's gonna incidentally. Just with a few good corrupted cards if you draft them, but it's really about getting a lot of artifacts out in the field and getting value out of that. Next, we've got blue-black, and this is Proliferate. Proliferate is in its largest concentration in blue and black in this set, and you'll see that in the form of this powerful Signpost Uncommon Voidwing Hybrid. Now, this is a very good Signpost Uncommon. It's a blue and a black for a 2/1 Phyrexian Bat that has flying and Toxic 1, meaning that players that get hit by it get a poison counter. And when you proliferate, return Voidwing Hybrid from your graveyard to your hand. So this is really going to fill in those gaps where you're having trouble closing out the game. It hits your opponent in the air. When they remove it, you proliferate, give them another poison counter, and get this Voidwing hybrid right back in your hand. And you're going to be backed up by a lot of powerful cards. I didn't put it right here, but there's a 2-mana sorcery that gives a creature -4/-4, and you proliferate. There's this 5-mana 4/4 that proliferates when it enters and when it dies. There's this claustrophobia effect that also proliferates. So there's a ton of ways to proliferate in the set, and I think this is intended to be kind of a controlling deck, where you get like a couple poison counters on your opponent the good Christian way, and then you proliferate the rest of them while you're proliferating your oil counters on maybe some of those cards. So kind of a bleeder deck in that way, but it plays as much removal as possible that also proliferates. Next, we've got black-red sack/oil counters aggro. So we've got Charforger to sort of guide us to figure out what this is doing, but this is definitely kind of the most puzzling limited archetype in the set. So Charforger is 1, a black, and a red for a 2/3 Phyrexian beast at uncommon. When Charforger enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 red Phyrexian goblin creature token. Whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put an oil counter on Charforger. Remove 3 oil counters from Charforger. Exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. So, Charforger's a good card. 3 mana for a 2/3 and a 1/1. Ignoring all that other text, which you probably should, is pretty fine. If this thing happens to see 3 other artifacts or creatures die, you get a card, which is great, obviously, then you've gotten a ton out of this. But even just as a 3-mana 2/3 that gives you a 1/1, probably not going to stick around. Definitely still worth 3 mana. But this archetype seems to be about sacrificing artifacts, kind of going a little bit wide, caring about oil counters, but not to the degree that the archetype we're going to look at next does. It's a hard archetype to pin down. I think it is very much... It's not going to be as aggressive and sacky as the red-black sack archetypes have been in recent limited formats, thinking of Streets of New Capenna or the Brothers' War. I think it's going to be a lot more value-oriented. It's going to feel a lot more like a 3-color mid-range deck in a constructed format, if that makes sense. But next we're going to talk about red and green oil counters spread out. So this Signpost Uncommon is Cinder/Ravager. It's a 6-drop. 4 red and a green for a 5/5 Phyrexian Warrior. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each permanent you control with an oil counter on it. And then it's got Vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. Now, notably, that's going to kill all their Phyrexian Mites. That's the most powerful part of that text on that card. But let's look at this as having 1 other permanent with an oil counter on it. A lot of these commons and uncommons that have an ability you can do once or twice signify that with an oil counter. A 5-mana 5/5 Vigilance that comes down and kills all your opponent's Phyrexian Mites, or comes down after combat and finishes off a creature, is good enough. 2 oil counters, and this becomes a 4-mana 5/5 Vigilance, which is crazy. So I think this will be a pretty good Signpost Uncommon, but essentially what the green-red deck is going to be trying to do is find as many cards that have an oil counter on them as possible. There's a Flametongue Kavu, basically, that instead of dealing damage flat, it deals damage based on the number of oil counters on your permanents. Something to consider. And there's a lot of cards in red and green that can get oil counters. It's most prevalent in red, but probably secondary in green. So this will be not necessarily an easy deck to put together, and a lot of these cards don't feel very good if they are the only oil counter card in your deck, if that makes sense. But I think you can make this deck come together, and Cinder/Ravager feels like it'll make it worth it some of the time. Next, we've got green-white Toxic Go Wide. Now, this is going to be kind of the most aggressive deck in the format, I feel like. Looking at this Signpost Uncommon, Slaughter Singer. Green and a white for a 2/2 Phyrexian Cleric with Toxic 2. So, getting 2 poison counters. Your opponent's dead in 5 hits from this thing. Whenever another creature you control with Toxic attacks, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So, curiously, this doesn't increase the Toxic count of those creatures. They'll still only do 1 poison damage. But it does make them harder to block with your opponent's creatures. And, the more damage to their life total doesn't hurt, for sure. But the fact that it makes them harder to block by maybe, making your Toxic 2/2 a Toxic 3/3 instead, makes your opponent think twice about, exchanging creatures with it, or maybe they can't. because it's bigger. And then we've got this Plague Nurse, which sort of can give all your other toxic creatures another toxic one, meaning that they'll do one more poison counter when they hit your opponent, and then this, this Flensing Raptor, this sort of flying toxic creature. But at the end of the day with this deck, you're trying to make might tokens, and you're trying to make little toxic guys to just kind of swing out and take your opponent's poison count to 10 as quickly as possible. Next, we're going to talk about the enemy color pairs. And first, we've got white-black Corrupted midrange. Now, these are cards that either generate value or just get you in a little bit above curve if your opponent has 3 poison counters. And you're not trying to kill your opponent with poison in this deck. You're just trying to get them to 3 so these cards will turn on. The Signpost Uncommon is Vivisection Evangelist. It's 3, a white, and a blue for a 4/4 Phyrexian Cleric with Vigilance, which is about on curve. But Corrupted, if your opponent has 3 or more poison counters, when this comes in, you destroy a creature or planeswalker they control. So this card is really good. It's a 2-for-1. It comes down and it kills something, even being an on-curve body, if your opponent just has 3 poison counters. And you can accomplish that with some of the cards that make those Phyrexian Might tokens. You can accomplish that with the little black flyer with Toxic. Lots of ways to accomplish that. And when this comes down and kills their biggest thing, it's probably going to be the biggest thing on the board 90% of the time. A 4/4 Vigilance. It swings in. It'll eventually kill them. It blocks. Great. We've got this Ravenous Necrotitan, which is a 4-mana 6/6 with a big downside, unless your opponent's Corrupted. And then it's just a 4-mana 6/6. And we love those in Limited. So that's what the white-black Corrupted mid-range deck is going to be trying to do. Next, we've got black-green Toxic mid-range. So this deck, I think, is trying to win through poison counters. Unlike the white-black deck that's trying to get your opponent to Corrupted, this one is trying to kill them with poison. And it's showing in the form of this, like Necrogen Rot Priest, the uncommon signpost card. 2, a black and a green for a 1/5 Phyrexian Zombie Cleric with Toxic 2. And whenever a creature you control with Toxic deals combat damage to a player, that player gets an additional poison counter. Now, this triggers for each of your Toxic creatures that hit your opponent. It is a triggered ability. And it's very powerful, I think, just because, it's adding an extra poison counter, including it for itself and for any of your Toxic creatures. And we haven't even read the last ability. For 1, a black and a green, target creature you control with Toxic gains Death Touch until end of turn. Now, the thing that makes this really powerful is the threat of activation. Since it's instant speed, like all abilities, you can swing, and your opponent doesn't want to block your Toxic creature, even if you haven't paid for this, because you could pay for it after they decide to block it. You've got this Necrogen Rot Priest swinging in. They don't want to block it with a 5/5 because you can pay 3, have it target itself, and trade with the 5/5. And, same with them blocking this with any creature that can't kill it, especially like a 3/3 or something. You get to keep your Rot Priest, you get to kill their thing. Insane. Not to mention the fact that this can give your Might tokens. Not that black and green are great at making those, but this can give your little Toxic creatures Death Touch. And then your opponent trying to block to eat them has to trade with them. So they're not going to do that because of the threat of activation. This is a very powerful card for that reason. But the rest of the archetype, it's going to play kind of similarly to the green-white deck in terms of trying to hit your opponent with poison to kill them. But you're going to be playing a higher curve, basically, is the difference. You're going to be playing these cards some Corrupted cards that care about your opponent having 3 poison counters, but also just some bigger guys with bigger stats and bigger Toxic counts. Next, we've got green-blue, the Simic color pair, and they are trying to do Proliferate/Toxic Ramp. So this is a powerful ramp deck. The Signpost Uncommon is Tainted Observer, and I love this art by Johan Boden. Great work. This is 1, a green and a blue for a 2/3 Phyrexian bird with flying. It's got Toxic 1, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay 2 if you do Proliferate. So we've got a lot of really, really good Proliferate cards. We've got a lot of, this has a way to put a single poison counter on your opponent, and then those Proliferates get better. Contagious Vorak is an insane common. It's a 3-mana 3/3 that can grab a land out of the top 4, and if you don't get a land, you proliferate. So, it can add poison counters, it can add those oil counters. Watchful Blister Zoa is a nice sort of ramp target that can kind of benefit from that proliferate as well, putting more oil counters on it so you draw more cards when it dies. This is just sort of a greedy value deck. This Signpost Uncommon doesn't seem terribly strong, and I think this deck is going to have trouble finding its identity, but I think if you just get enough strong green and blue commons and uncommons, you'll feel fine playing this deck. Oops, I accidentally went back, so we're going to have to exit. It's a bit of a technical difficulty. Alrighty, this is blue-red oil counters Spellslinger. So the Signpost Uncommon is Serum Core Chimera. It's 2 a blue and a red for a 2/4 Phyrexian Chimera with flying. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on Serum Core Chimera. Now there's a lot of cards with that text on them. And then remove 3 oil counters from Serum Core Chimera. Draw a card. Then you may discard a non-land card. When you discard a card this way, Serum Core Chimera deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker. Activate only as a sorcery. This card's amazing. A 4-mana 2/4 flyer feels pretty fine. And then they essentially have to remove this, because if you can, either through casting the instants and sorceries or through proliferating, get 3 counters on it, it's going to draw you a card, and then one of the cards in your hand becomes Lightning Bolt, right? You can hit one of your opponent's creature or planeswalkers for 3 just by discarding a card. And you don't have to do that. If you want to just draw the card and keep it, you're welcome to. So this card's great. There's a number of other cards that get oil counters when you cast non-creature spells and then do things with those oil counters. You'll see Trawler Drake and Sawblade Scamp on your screen right now. This deck seems relatively powerful. There's a lot of good removal spells and decent sort of draw filtering spells in these colors that are cheap to trigger these non-creature spell synergies, but they're also going to work well with your proliferate and with any of your oil counter synergies. So this deck really is making use of a lot of different aspects of the set, and I think that'll make it uniquely powerful. This is the blue-red oil counters Spellslinger archetype. And then we've got our final limited archetype, and the one I'm personally very excited about. I am a huge sucker for Living Weapon and these the Kaldheim cycle of equipments. Any equipment that comes in with a creature equipped to it I think is just really cool. This is red-white for Mirrodin. So this is Bladehold Warwhip is the Signpost Uncommon. It's 1 a red and a white for an equipment with 4 Mirrodin, so it's going to come in with a 2/2 equipped to it. Equip abilities you activate of other equipment cost 1 less to activate. Equipped creature has double strike, and this equips for 3 a red and a white. So it's 3 mana for a 2/2 double strike, which is not terrible. That's a pretty decent rate. It makes all of your other equipment cheaper to equip, and you can give that double strike to another creature later, even after this one gets killed or whatever. You can move it on to something else for 5 mana, which is pretty steep. But just the fact that this sits around. And then there's a lot of 4 Mirrodin equipment that would just be barely below rate if they were a creature with those stats instead of an equipment. But they have that ability to get spread around. We've got Volshock Splitter, which is this sort of Bone Splitter, but it comes with a 2/2, so it's just a 4 mana 4/2 that can move around the Bone Splitter afterward. Or Mirren Bardiche, this 5 mana 4/3 Vigilance essentially, but you can move around the +2/+1 in Vigilance later. We've got a lot of these. It's a lot of value on the card, being able to basically leave behind half the creature for later to put onto another creature. So I'm very excited to play with this. This is also the only limited archetype that doesn't really use counters at all. You might get a stray oil counters card that's worth putting in your deck, but it doesn't proliferate, it doesn't use poison counters, doesn't use oil counters. So if all of that seems kind of daunting to you, this limited archetype is here for you. Now we're going to talk about tips and tricks. And this is sort of just general thoughts, and I want your guys' opinion on this too, so please let me know in the comments what you think of these strategies. But I essentially just want to talk about a few cards and what role I think they're going to play in the format. So we've got the spheres. There's a cycle of common spheres, and I showed 3 of them here, but there's 5. They're in all 5 colors. And they have the subtype sphere, which is not relevant in limited. It'll only be relevant in constructed formats. But essentially, they come in tapped, they tap for their one color, and you can pay 1 and 1 of their color and tap them and sacrifice them to draw a card. So these lands are kind of like clues. Now, personally, we compare them to the tap lands from Streets of New Capenna at Common that tap for 2 different colors and cost 4 to crack and draw a card. And those, you felt pretty good about playing. I don't know, when in the pack you picked them depended on how many colors you were playing and how heavy your splash was of a 3rd color. But in this set, these only tap for 1 mana. The fact that they come in tapped hurts, but in Limited, you can have some tapped lands. And the fact that you can crack them later to draw cards to try to find some action is really powerful. So I think when you're playing pre-release, when you have these in your sealed pool, obviously they're diminishing returns and all, but I think if you have like 3, you at least play 3, maybe 4 of these. In lieu of basic lands, just because they let you cycle through your deck later in the game, and them coming in tapped isn't always going to matter. But when do you pick them in draft? And that's a tough question to answer. In my draft sim practice drafts of this set, I have found that a lot of them tend to get picked relatively quickly. They don't get picked before removal or like very good creatures or anything, but they're getting picked before a lot of combat tricks. They're getting picked before some pretty playable creatures. I think you're gonna pick these probably. You feel pretty happy if you find one of these in the last 5 cards of the pack, and I think they are gonna be very good. I think they're definitely worth playing. There are games these are going to win you, and I don't think there are many games that these coming in tapped are going to lose you the game. But there are games where that card is going to be the difference between losing and winning. So I'm curious to hear what y'all's thoughts are, but that's my take on the Sphere cycle at Common. And then we've got, oh my gosh, I accidentally skipped 2 slides again. I am so sorry for my lack of professionalism. So we've got this slide, which is titled Don't Make a Splash. Now, this set is similar to the Brothers' War before it, in that it is very difficult to justify splashing a 3rd color. Now, the 2 cards I put up here are Kaya Intangible Slayer, which is no doubt an incredibly powerful bomb. This card is cracked. If you cast it, you're probably going to win the game. But it costs double white and double black, and what that means is you have to be in white and black to play this card. You can't be playing black-green and splashing white and get double white consistently, even on a 7-drop. And then we've got Atraxa Grand Unifier, which is 3, a green, a white, a blue, and a black, so 7 mana and 4 colors for a 7/7 Phyrexian Angel. And it's got a lot of text on it. It's a 7/7 with Flying Vigilance, Death Touch, and Lifelink. And when it comes in, I'm not going to read that whole ability to you, but you're going to draw probably at least 3 cards, maybe 4 off of it when it comes in, which is insane. Gives you an insane amount of card selection. But you have to play 4 colors in a limited format which does not have any common and uncommon fixing, right? The cycle of common lands in the set tap for 1 color. It's those spheres that I showed you. And I think you are better off, obviously probably pick Atraxa because it's probably going to be worth more than your draft. But if you open these in sealed, you have to be very, very lucky to play this Atraxa. And if you are picking it in draft, you should not be trying to put it in your deck. Next, we've got this sort of dichotomy between Corrupted and trying to win with 10 poison counters. Before you play, while you're building your deck, you should be trying to decide whether your deck is trying to get to 3 poison counters on your opponent to activate your Corrupted abilities, or to 10 poison counters to kill your opponent. Now, obviously, when you're playing and you're proliferating, you should always be putting a poison counter on your opponent, because there's no reason not to. 10 poison counters might kill them. Or you might get to 10 poison counters, and that will kill them if you do. But when you're building your deck, you should be thinking, am I trying to get my opponent to 3 poison counters for my Corrupted, or am I trying to get them to 10 poison counters to kill them? And you should be building your deck accordingly. You shouldn't be playing cards that, just put poison counters on your opponent and not much else if you're just trying to get them Corrupted. You should be evaluating proliferate cards a lot more highly if you're trying to get your opponent to 10 poison counters than if you're just trying to get them to 3 and you don't have a lot of oil counter synergies. Obviously, corrupted cards are good in both kinds of decks, but you should also be ready to decide if your deck is not going to try to do corrupted at all. Like, if you are playing, a red-white deck, like the red-white equipment deck, or like the red-green oil counters deck, and you've just got a couple toxic creatures in your deck, you don't want to be trying to think about, well, am I going to get my opponent to 3 poison counters to make this corrupted card better if you only have 3 cards that can put poison counters on your opponent. You want to be thinking about what sort of rung on the ladder your deck is. Is it trying to get them to 3 poison counters? Is it trying to get them to 10 poison counters? Or is it not bothering with poison counters? And choose cards accordingly so that your deck is working toward the correct goal instead of trying to do several things inefficiently. And last, we're going to talk about limited bombs. This is part I don't like to dwell on. You'll notice that my limited reviews focus on commons and uncommons, like any good limited review does, because that's the vast majority of the cards you're going to be seeing. When you look at bombs, they're just very powerful rares that swing the game in your favor and become very difficult for your opponent to win after that point. But here are just a list of the most powerful bombs in the format, and we're not going to read all of them, but we're going to talk about them. Single color bombs, you should always play them if they're in your colors, and you should sometimes even pivot to their colors, especially if it's like pack 2 and you're not in one of these colors and you open one of these single color bombs. But without further ado, let's talk about them. We've got Vraska Betrayal Sting, a mythic planeswalker that can remove things to protect itself, draw you cards, and proliferate. Just an insane value engine. Nissa Ascended Animist, a completed planeswalker as well that can be a 5-drop, a 6-drop, or a 7-drop if you have quadruple green. And that pluses to make an XX where X is its loyalty. Even if you ignore much of the rest of that text, just being able to make a thing that's 1/1 bigger every turn is really crazy. Then we've got the Eternal Wanderer, a rare planeswalker that a lot of people are already pre-dreading having to play against. It's a 6-mana planeswalker, and it can only be attacked by 1 creature each combat. It can flicker things, it can make 2/2s with double strike as its 0, and its ult can happen right when it comes down, and it does this sort of tragic arrogance thing to you and your opponent's creatures, and you get to pick the creature that each of you keeps. So very, very, very strong card. Next, we've got Skrull of Defector Might, which I was having a hard time understanding why this was good, but it does kind of a mom impression. It sort of behaves like Mother of Runes does. Obviously, it does not allow the creature to block safely. It just gives hexproof and unblockable from a color, but it also gives Toxic 1. That's worth noting, and it itself has Toxic 1. So it's sort of a leader for the might sort of strategy. It is a might itself, and it's good for, giving your large toxic creatures unblockable and trying to close out the game that way. We've got Thrun, Breaker of Silence, formerly Thrun the Last Troll. Very powerful green creature. A lot of text on this guy. All of it good. Uncounterable Trample, 5/5. Hexproof from non-green. I don't know why they spelled it out, if there's some subtle difference between just what it says and what just hexproof from non-green. But it's also indestructible on your turn. Just a lot of text, all of it good. And then we've got Sword of Forge and Frontier, a card that a lot of people are really excited about. This is the 9th card in the Sword cycle, so we're just missing the blue-black one, but this is the red one. It does all the things that Sword of Blank and Blank does. It also when it hits your opponent, it exiles the top 2 cards of your library. You may play those cards this turn. You may play an additional land this turn. So even if your opponent's not in a red-green deck, this card is passable just by the fact that it gives +2/+2 and a great on-hit ability. But if your opponent is playing red or green, this card is obnoxious. You should be playing it in your draft deck, for sure. You should be picking it in draft over pretty much anything else. And then we've got our last batch of bomb rares and mythics. This Planeswalker, Luca, Bound to Ruin. It's a red-green completed Planeswalker of classic Magic the Gathering fan favorite character Luca completed. He's doing an impression of Garruk Wildspeaker. Is it a good impression? Kinda. This card's great in limited. I mean, I think this card will be disgusting in limited. It minuses to make a 3/3 with Toxic 1, same minus as Garruk Wildspeaker. For the same mana cost as Garruk Wildspeaker if you pay life. Yeah, this is just a great card. If you're in red-green, or if you can pull off the pivot in pack 2 or something, you should definitely be playing this. Then we've got Dragon Wing Glider. And it's a 4 Mirrodin equipment, but it ends up being essentially that 5-mana 4/4 flying haste that we've seen at Mythic in several sets in the past few years, limited formats. It started with Glorybringer, which was probably the best rare in Amonkhet Limited, mostly because of that Exert removal ability, but also just by virtue of being a 5-mana 4/4 flying haste. And then it continued with Goldspan Dragon, which was an obnoxious standard card. That, again, it also generated you mana, it made your treasures more valuable, it couldn't really be removed because you could generate a treasure when it got targeted and then counter the spell with the treasure, so this is not any of those, but it can move the +2/+2 flying and haste onto something else later. So Dragon Wing Glider is definitely a very good rare. Then we've got Kaito Dancing Shadow, which if you're in these two colors, or if you can pull off the pivot, it's a Dimir card, a lot of text on here. You can bounce your value creatures to let him activate his loyalty abilities again. And his loyalty abilities are not bad. The 0 is draw a card. The +1 basically takes a creature out of combat until your next turn. And the -2 makes a 2/2 with Death Touch that when it leaves the battlefield drains your opponent for 2. So 3 very powerful loyalty abilities, even if you couldn't activate them twice. But when you hit your opponent, you can bounce a creature, and then he can activate his loyalty abilities twice that turn. So Kaito Dancing Shadow is an incredibly powerful card. Those are the best bond rares in the format, and with all that said, I really want to sincerely thank you for watching all the way to the end, and I want to implore you once again to perhaps subscribe, throw me a comment with what you're excited about for this limited format. Which deck are you excited to draft? Personally, for me, the 2 decks I'm most excited to draft are the red-white equipment deck and the blue-black sort of poison bleeder proliferate control deck. Those are the 2 that I'm really partial to and would really like to make work in this format. Thanks again for watching. Please consider subscribing and liking, and I hope you have an excellent time doing your pre-release, doing your draft events for this set, and just playing Phyrexia All-Will-Be-One and playing Magic. I hope to have another video essay or 2 out before the next set's limited format guide. Sorry, this one just kind of snuck up on me. I had a lot of life stuff going on. But I appreciate you all, and I hope you have an excellent night. Thank you for watching.